Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Indianapolis was already 2 hours behind me when I decided to skip the interstate and take the back roads home that October evening. I'd just finished a job interview at a pharmaceutical company, my third that month since getting laid off. And honestly, the thought of sitting in rush hour traffic while replaying another rejection in my head seemed unbearable. Being 29 and starting over from scratch wasn't part of the plan, but neither was the factory closure that left half my town unemployed, so here I was, choosing random county roads through rural Indiana just to feel like I had some control over something. The cornfields rose up on both sides like canyon walls, dry and rustling in that late harvest way that makes everything sound like whispers. I'd lived in Fort Wayne my whole life, but these particular backroads were new to me, each turn revealing another stretch of identical stalks that seemed to go on forever, broken only by the occasional weathered barn or grain silo standing against the dimming sky. My phone battery was at 12% when I noticed the GPS had stopped updating 20 minutes ago. The little blue dot frozen somewhere near a town called Millbrook that I'd never heard of. The screen showed 6:52 p.m., and the October sun was already sinking behind the corn, throwing long shadows across the dirt road I'd somehow ended up on. I kept telling myself the next intersection would bring me back to pavement, back to civilization. But each turn just led deeper into the maze of agricultural roads that probably only made sense to the farmers who'd been driving them for generations. The Nissan Altima wasn't exactly built for this terrain. Every pothole sent a worrying creak through the suspension, and dust was billowing up behind me in thick clouds that caught the dying light. When the road narrowed to barely more than a tractor path, corn stalks scraping against both sides of my car, with a sound like fingernails on metal, I finally admitted to myself that I was completely, utterly lost. The engine started making the noise around 7:15, just as the last sliver of sun disappeared behind the horizon. It began as a subtle clicking, like a playing card and bicycle spokes, but within minutes it had evolved into this grinding metal-on-metal sound that made my chest tight with panic. The temperature gauge was creeping toward the red zone, and wisps of steam were starting to curl up from under the hood, visible in the beams of my headlights that now provided the only illumination on this forgotten stretch of dirt. I pumped the brakes, feeling the car shudder and resist until I finally came to a stop in what seemed like the middle of absolute nowhere. The silence that followed when I turned off the ignition was complete. No distant highway noise, no dogs barking, not even the sound of farming equipment. Just the ticking of hot metal cooling and the endless rustling of corn that surrounded me on all sides, so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet into the rows even with my high beams on. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes, just staring at my phone as it searched desperately for even a single bar of signal. Nothing. The battery dropped to 11% while I watched, and I realized I needed to save what little power remained in case I found a spot with coverage. My hands were trembling. Not from cold, but from that special kind of fear that comes when you realize exactly how alone and unprepared you are. The nearest town I could remember passing was at least 40 minutes back, and that was when the car was actually running. I popped the hood release and stepped out into the October night, immediately hit by how much colder it had gotten once the sun went down. The air smelled like dried corn husks and diesel fuel, and underneath that, something else. Maybe fertilizer. Maybe just the scent of soil that had been baking all day and was now releasing its heat into the darkness. The hood was too hot to touch at first, and when I finally got it propped open, a cloud of steam billowed out, making me stumble backward into the dirt road. I knew absolutely nothing about cars beyond checking oil and adding windshield fluid, another life skill I'd always relied on others to handle. The engine block was making these pinging sounds as it cooled, and I could see fluid dripping steadily onto the ground, creating a dark puddle that looked black in the beam of my phone's flashlight. That's when I noticed it, a pinpoint of light moving through the corn, maybe 200 yards away, swaying slightly like someone walking with a flashlight. Relief flooded through me so fast I actually laughed out loud. Thank God, I thought. A farmer checking his fields, or maybe someone else whose car had broken down earlier. I raised my arm and was about to shout when something made me hesitate. The light wasn't moving along the rows like you'd expect from someone walking between planted corn. It was cutting straight through, stalks snapping and rustling, heading directly toward me. I stood there next to my dead car, watching that light get closer, and every instinct I had started screaming that something was wrong. Who walks through corn like that at night? The stalks are planted in rows specifically so you can walk between them during harvest. But this person, if it was a person, was bulldozing straight through like the corn wasn't even there. The sound reached me then, that distinctive crack and swoosh of breaking stalks, getting louder with each passing second. I turned in a slow circle, suddenly aware of how exposed I was standing in the middle of this dirt road, with my car's headlights creating a bubble of visibility that probably made me look like a lighthouse in an ocean of darkness. There were no farmhouses visible in any direction, no distant porch lights or barn security lamps, just walls of corn that could have been hiding anything. The light stopped moving for a moment, maybe 100 yards away now, and I could swear whoever was holding it was watching me, evaluating, deciding something. My mouth went dry as I tried to call out a greeting, but the words died in my throat when the light started moving again. Faster this time, with purpose. The sound of breaking corn stalks grew louder, more violent, like someone was running through them now instead of walking. I scrambled back into my car, slamming the door and hitting the lock button so hard my finger hurt. The rational part of my brain kept saying this was probably just a farmer, maybe angry about someone being on his property. But farmers don't move like that through their own fields. They don't destroy their own crops. Through my windshield, I could see the light getting closer, maybe 50 yards now, and I could make out the shadowy outline of corn stalks falling away from whatever was pushing through them. My phone showed 9% battery when I tried calling 911, but the call wouldn't connect. Just that horrible beeping sound that means no signal, not even for emergency calls. Then the light went out. Just like that, complete darkness where it had been, and the sound of breaking corn stopped too. The silence was worse than the noise had been because now I had no idea where they were or what they were doing. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, breathing so hard the windows were starting to fog up, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my pulse in my ears. A minute passed, then two, and I was just starting to think maybe they'd given up and left when something slammed into the passenger side of my car, hard enough to rock it on its suspension. I couldn't help the scream that ripped out of me as I jerked away from the door, my elbow hitting the horn which blared out into the darkness. Through the fogged passenger window, I could barely make out a shape, human-sized but wrong somehow, just standing there, perfectly still. Then came the sound that still wakes me up at night. Fingernails slowly dragging across the glass, deliberate and patient, like someone testing how strong it was. The scratching moved around the car methodically. Passenger window, rear passenger, back windshield, then stopping at the driver's side, right next to where I was hunched against the center console trying to make myself as small as possible. This close, even through the fogged glass, I could see more details that made my whole body go rigid with terror. The person was wearing what looked like a medical gown, the thin kind they give you at hospitals, completely inappropriate for the cold October night. Their hair was long and matted, hanging in clumps that might have been blonde once but now looked gray with dirt or worse. But it was the eyes that made me bite down on my knuckle to keep from screaming again, wide open, unblinking, staring at me through the window with an intensity that felt like being studied by something that had forgotten how to be human. They raised one hand and placed it flat against the glass, and I could see dirt caked under those long fingernails, what might have been dried blood on their wrist. They tilted their heads slowly, like a dog hearing a strange sound, never breaking eye contact. I fumbled for my phone with numb fingers, desperate enough to try 911 again even though I knew it wouldn't work. 7% battery now. The figure outside started making sounds, not words exactly, more like attempts at words, these wet, gurgling noises that might have been speech if their throat wasn't damaged somehow. They kept tapping on the window with one finger, gentle and rhythmic, like they were trying to communicate in code. That's when I noticed the medical bracelet on their wrist, the plastic kind with printed information. Though I couldn't read it through the fog and darkness, a horrible thought crept into my mind. What if this person had escaped from somewhere, maybe a psychiatric facility or hospital? Indiana has several state facilities and someone in a medical gown wandering rural roads at night. But that didn't explain how they'd moved through the corn, or why they seemed to be enjoying this, because I swear I could see the corners of their mouth pulling up in something that wasn't quite a smile but wanted to be. The tapping stopped abruptly, and the figure stepped back from my car, disappearing into the darkness beyond my headlights' reach. For a moment, I dared to hope they were leaving, but then I heard the trunk pop open. I'd locked the doors but forgotten the trunk release was broken. It had been that way for months, just another repair I couldn't afford. The car shifted as weight settled into the trunk area, and I could hear them rummaging through my emergency kit, metal clanking against metal. The tire iron, they'd found the tire iron. Panic shot through me like electricity as I turned the ignition key, pumping the gas pedal and pleading with the dead engine to somehow miraculously start. Nothing but clicks and the wheeze of a motor that had given up. The trunk slammed shut, and footsteps circled back to my door, slow and measured. Then came the first hit, the tire iron smashing into my side mirror, sending plastic and glass spraying across the dirt. They weren't trying to break in yet, just showing me they could, demonstrating what was about to happen. I did the only thing I could think of, laid on the horn and didn't let up. The blaring sound split the night, echoing off the corn and hopefully, reaching someone, anyone who might call the police. The figure outside actually stumbled backward, hands going to their ears, that grotesque almost smile turning into a grimace of pain or anger. They swung the tire iron at my windshield but missed, hitting the hood instead with a metallic clang that left a dent I could see even in the darkness. My phone battery hit 5% as I kept my palm pressed on the horn, watching this person in a hospital gown rage against my car, swinging the tire iron wildly now, no longer methodical but furious. They tried to scream something over the noise, but it came out as more of that liquid gargling, and I realized with sick certainty that something was definitely wrong with their throat. Maybe self-inflicted, maybe the reason they'd been institutionalized in the first place. The horn kept blaring and I kept pressing, even as my ears rang and my head pounded, because stopping meant silence, and silence meant they'd start working on getting inside again. Then I saw them, headlights cutting through the darkness from the direction I'd come, bouncing over the rutted dirt road. The figure in the hospital gown saw them too, their heads snapping toward the approaching lights with animal-like alertness. They dropped the tire iron and, without any hesitation, turned and crashed back into the corn, vanishing into the stalks as suddenly as they'd appeared. The gurgling sounds faded quickly, swallowed by the rustling maze of dried corn that seemed to close behind them like water. I kept the horn going until the vehicle, a massive John Deere green pickup, pulled up beside me, an older man with a gray beard rolling down his window with a concerned, confused expression. I finally let go of the horn, my palm throbbing, ears ringing in the sudden quiet. The farmer, because that's what he was, asked if I was okay, said he'd been checking his irrigation equipment 2 fields over when he heard the horn going crazy. I tried to explain about the person in the hospital gown, pointing at the smashed mirror, the dents in my car, but my words came out jumbled and hysterical. He believed me, though. Told me there'd been an escape from Logansport State Hospital earlier that day, some patient with a history of violence who'd injured 2 orderlies getting out. The police had been searching the main roads, but nobody thought to check these back farm routes. He called it in on his CB radio while I sat there shaking, then waited with me for 40 minutes until the state police arrived with their dogs and searchlights. They found the tire iron right where it had been dropped, found footprints and torn fabric on a corn stalk, but the person was gone, swallowed up by miles and miles of agricultural land. The police took my statement, arranged for a tow truck, gave me a ride to a motel in the nearest town. They caught the patient 3 days later, hiding in an abandoned grain silo near Lafayette, nearly dead from exposure and dehydration. I never learned their name or what they'd done to end up in that hospital, and honestly, I didn't want to know. What I do know is that I haven't driven anywhere without a charger cable since, and I take the interstate now, always the interstate, no matter how bad the traffic is. The farmhouse came cheap because nobody wanted to drive 40 minutes just to get groceries. That suited me fine after the divorce papers went through in August. 37 and starting fresh seemed easier when the nearest neighbor lived 2 miles down the gravel road. The property stretched maybe 5 acres total, most of it taken up by corn that the previous tenant had planted but never harvested. By the time I moved in that September, those stalks stood almost 7 feet tall, creating a dense green wall that ran right up to my backyard. The realtor, Nancy something or other, kept apologizing about the unkempt field, promising the owner would have it cleared before winter. I told her not to worry about it. The rustling sound at night actually helped me sleep, like white noise from nature instead of those machines people buy in the city. The first signs appeared maybe 3 weeks after I settled in. I'd gone out one morning to drink coffee on the back porch, watching the sun climb over those endless rows of corn, when I spotted a crumpled McDonald's wrapper near where the grass met the field, then a Marlboro butt, still fresh enough that the filter hadn't yellowed from rain. My first thought was teenagers, probably local kids who'd found a spot to smoke where their parents wouldn't catch them. God knows I'd done the same thing at their age, sneaking behind the gymnasium with stolen cigarettes. The muddy footprint on my deck bothered me more, but October had been wet, and delivery drivers never watched where they stepped. I grabbed a trash bag, picked up the litter, and made a mental note to mention it to Nancy next time she called to check how I was settling in. Kids would be kids, and eventually they'd get bored and find somewhere else to hang out. A week passed before I found the makeshift bed. I'd been walking along the field's edge, looking for my cat Brutus, who liked to hunt mice in the tall grass, when I noticed how the corn stalks bent inward about 20 feet from my bedroom window. Not broken, just carefully pushed aside to create a narrow tunnel. Curiosity got the better of me, and I ducked into the opening, pushing through the dense leaves that scratched at my arms. The smell hit me first, stale sweat mixed with something chemical, like old cologne trying to mask body odor. Someone had flattened maybe 6 feet of corn stalks into a rough oval, creating a hidden pocket completely invisible from the outside. Empty beer cans lined one edge. A ratty sleeping bag lay crumpled in the corner, still damp from the morning dew. But what made my throat close up was the collection of cigarette butts arranged in a neat little pyramid, all Marlboros, all facing the same direction, toward my house. The logical part of my brain kept insisting this was still teenagers, maybe some kid who'd gotten kicked out and needed a place to crash. But teenagers didn't organize their trash like that. Teenagers didn't position themselves with a perfect sightline to my bedroom window, where the corn had been bent just enough to create a gap no bigger than a fist. I backed out of that space, my shirt catching on the rough stalks, and walked straight into my house to call the sheriff's department. The deputy who showed up, a young guy named Brandon who couldn't have been older than 25, walked through the space with me, took some photos, and promised they'd increase patrols. He suggested motion lights for the backyard and maybe some cameras if I could afford them. The way he kept checking his phone and glancing at his watch told me everything. Weird trash in a cornfield didn't exactly qualify as an emergency in his book. I installed the motion lights that same afternoon, driving to the hardware store in town and spending money I didn't really have on 4 industrial-strength floodlights. The clerk, an older man with grease under his fingernails, helped me pick out the brightest ones they had, the kind that would blind you if you looked directly at them. While I was there, I grabbed a deadbolt for the back door and one of those wooden dowels to jam in the sliding glass door track. The installation took me until dark, up and down the ladder with a drill that kept slipping in my sweaty palms. Every rustle from the corn made me whip around, expecting to see someone standing there. But the field stayed empty, just endless rows swaying in the evening breeze. That night, the lights triggered constantly. A raccoon at midnight, wind-blown leaves at 2, a possum around 4. Each time that harsh white light flooded my yard, I'd jolt awake and peer through the blinds, scanning the illuminated grass for footprints, for movement, for anything that would prove I wasn't going crazy. The silence lasted 5 days. 5 days of motion lights catching nothing but animals. 5 days of checking that spot in the corn to find it undisturbed. 5 days of almost convincing myself that whoever it was had been scared off by the deputy's visit. Then, on Saturday night, all 4 lights went out at once. Not triggered, just dead like someone had cut the power. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but the screen stayed black no matter how many times I pressed the button. The landline in the kitchen gave me nothing but silence. Even my laptop, which had been charging on the counter, wouldn't turn on. I stood in my dark kitchen, listening to my own breathing mix with the eternal rustling of corn. And that's when I heard it. The distinct sound of a sliding door being tested. That soft bump when someone lifts it to see if it's locked. The dowel held, but whoever was out there kept trying, patient and methodical, lifting and releasing, like they had all the time in the world. The testing stopped after maybe 10 minutes, but I knew he hadn't left. Through the kitchen window, I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow passing between my car and the shed, too tall and upright to be an animal. My keys hung on the hook by the front door, 15 feet away, but reaching them meant crossing in front of the living room windows. The old farmhouse had too many windows, I realized. Windows I'd loved when I moved in because they let in so much natural light. Now each dark pane felt like an eye, like someone could be pressed against any of them, watching me stand frozen in my kitchen. I grabbed a knife from the block, the big one I used for chopping vegetables, and tried to think. The nearest neighbor, the Gibsons, lived 2 miles away. Even if I ran, even if I made it to the road, it would take 20 minutes to reach their house. 20 minutes in the dark with someone following through the corn, knowing every shortcut while I stumbled blind down the gravel road. A soft knock on the back door made me bite down on my own tongue to keep from screaming. Not pounding or aggressive, just 3 gentle taps, like a neighbor stopping by to borrow sugar. Then his voice came through the wood, conversational and calm, with this odd sing-song quality that made my spine go rigid. "I know you're awake in there. I've been watching you for weeks now, learning your routines. You make chamomile tea before bed, read those mystery novels in your bedroom until your eyes get heavy. You sleep on your left side, facing the window. Did you know you talk in your sleep sometimes? Mostly about work stress. But last night you said a man's name, Christopher. Is that the ex-husband? He knew things no one could know unless they'd been inside my house, unless they'd stood next to my bed while I slept. The knife felt useless in my hand, a joke against someone who'd been close enough to hear me breathing in the dark, and I'd never even known. "The police won't come," he continued, his mouth so close to the door I could hear his lips brush the wood. "Your phone's dead, remember? And even if you got to your car, well, I took care of that earlier. Cut the fuel line while you were in the shower this evening. You use lavender shampoo, by the way. The smell carries through the bathroom vent." My legs started shaking so hard I had to lean against the counter to stay upright. This morning's shower, I'd felt safe, normal, washing my hair and planning my weekend. He'd been right outside, close enough to smell my shampoo, sabotaging my car while I stood naked and vulnerable behind a thin curtain. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, and I heard something metal scraping against the door frame. "You're going to let me in, and we're going to talk about why you've been so rude, ignoring me when I've put so much effort into getting to know you. Or I'm going to come in anyway and we'll have a very different conversation." The scraping sound meant he was working on the lock, and the old farmhouse doors weren't exactly high security. I had maybe 2 minutes before he got through. The front door was an option, but running into the dark meant running blind while he knew the property better than I did after weeks of surveillance. Hiding seemed pointless when he'd already proven he could get inside whenever he wanted. Then I remembered the crawl space access in the bedroom closet. The realtor had mentioned it during the tour, apologizing for the lack of a proper basement. It led under the house, coming out through a wooden panel near the front porch that looked decorative from the outside. If I could get into the crawl space before he broke through the back door, maybe I could slip out the front while he searched the house. I moved as quietly as I could toward the bedroom, avoiding the creaky board near the hallway that I'd learned about my first week here. Behind me, the scraping continued, mixed with his humming. Some tune I didn't recognize, cheerful and wrong in the darkness. The crawl space was exactly as horrible as I'd imagined. Maybe 3 feet high, dirt floor, thick with spider webs and the smell of rotting wood. I pulled the panel closed behind me and started crawling, trying not to think about what else might be down here with me. My knees sank into the soft earth, and something with too many legs skittered across my hand. Above me, I heard the back door finally give way, then heavy footsteps moving through my kitchen. "Where did you go?" His voice was louder now, annoyed rather than conversational. "This doesn't have to be difficult. I've been patient, haven't I? Weeks of watching, waiting for the right time to introduce myself properly." The footsteps moved toward the living room and I crawled faster, my fingers searching for the panel that should be somewhere ahead. The space narrowed as I went, forcing me to army crawl on my belly through dirt that tasted like decay when I accidentally breathed through my mouth. His footsteps stopped directly overhead, and I heard him opening closet doors, checking rooms, methodical in his search. My fingers finally found the wooden panel, and I pushed against it slowly, terrified it would creak. Cool night air hit my face as it opened, and I could see my front yard bathed in moonlight, the road just 50 yards away. I squeezed through the opening, dirt in my hair and eyes, and started running before I was even fully standing. Behind me, I heard him yell. Not words, just raw frustration when he realized I wasn't in the house. The gravel road tore at my bare feet, but I kept running, powered by adrenaline and terror. Halfway to the Gibsons' house, headlights appeared ahead, their teenage son Nathan coming home late from work. I practically threw myself in front of his truck, screaming for help, probably looking absolutely insane, covered in dirt and spiderwebs. But Nathan didn't hesitate. He pulled me into the truck, locked the doors, and drove straight to his parents' house while calling 911 on his cell. When the real deputies arrived an hour later, not Brandon but older officers who took everything seriously, they found my back door broken, muddy footprints through my house, and that sleeping spot in the corn. But the man himself was gone, vanished into the miles of farmland and forest that surrounded the county. They never caught him. The investigation turned up DNA from the sleeping bag, fingerprints on my door frame, but nothing in any database. The detective assigned to my case a woman named Diane Russell, who'd worked stalking cases for 15 years, told me that wasn't unusual. "Some of these guys, they're ghosts until they escalate," she said, sitting across from me at the police station, while I gave my fifth statement. "You were smart to run. Smart to trust your instincts about those first signs." They found more evidence in the corn over the following days. Notebooks wrapped in plastic with detailed observations about my daily routines. Photographs taken through my windows with a telephoto lens. Even recordings of my phone conversations somehow captured from outside the house. The quantity suggested he'd been watching for months before I moved in. That maybe he'd been watching the property itself, waiting for someone like me, alone, isolated, vulnerable, to rent it. The owner had the corn cleared within a week, revealing 3 other makeshift camps at different vantage points around the property, each one positioned to watch a different side of the house. I stayed with the Gibsons for 2 weeks, while I arranged to break the lease and find somewhere new to live. A studio apartment in Columbus with a doorman and security cameras, neighbors close enough to hear if I screamed. The landlord tried to keep my security deposit, claiming I'd violated the lease terms, until Diane made a few phone calls and suddenly he was very accommodating, even refunding my last month's rent. Sometimes I Google the address of that farmhouse, checking if anyone new has rented it. So far, it stays empty. The listing photos showing my former bedroom with its big windows, the cleared field behind it looking naked and exposed without the corn. I still wake up some nights, convinced I can hear that patient lifting and releasing of a door, that cheerful humming in the darkness. My therapist says it's normal, that hypervigilance takes time to fade. But I notice things now, how many windows a place has, whether the doors are solid wood or hollow, if there are too many blind spots around a property. And I'll never again ignore those first small signs, those little violations that your mind wants to explain away. Because somewhere out there, he's probably doing it again, picking some other isolated farmhouse, some other woman living alone, starting with cigarette butts and footprints while he learns her routines, patient and methodical, waiting for the perfect night to finally introduce himself. The cornfield behind the Brennan property stretches for what feels like miles, and during late August of 2022, the stalks stood nearly 8 feet tall, creating these dense walls of green that whispered whenever the wind picked up. I'd driven out there with my girlfriend Jess and our friend group for what was supposed to be just another bonfire before everyone scattered for college again. The Brennans owned about 200 acres of farmland outside Cedar Rapids, and their daughter Allison had been hosting these gatherings since we were 16. That night, there were maybe 12 of us sitting around the fire pit they'd built about 50 yards from where the corn started, passing around cheap beer and talking about nothing important, while sparks drifted up toward the stars. Allison had just turned 19 the week before, and she kept joking about how this might be our last real summer together before adult life swallowed us whole. Around 11 that night, Allison's phone slipped out of her hoodie pocket when she stood up to grab another drink from the cooler, and we all heard it hit something hard before bouncing into the darkness toward the cornfield. She laughed and said she'd be right back, turned on her phone's flashlight using Jess's phone to call hers so it would light up, and walked toward the edge of the corn where we could hear it buzzing. The stalks swallowed her immediately, but we could track her movement by the glow of the flashlight filtering through the corn, and her voice calling out that she could see it, just a little further in. Her friend Kayla was recording some stupid video for Instagram and actually caught Allison disappearing between the rows, this casual moment that would later become evidence. We kept talking and laughing, waiting for her to come back, but after maybe 3 or 4 minutes, her boyfriend Noah called out asking if she needed help, and that's when we realized we couldn't see the flashlight anymore or hear her moving through the stalks. Noah stood up first, cupping his hands around his mouth and shouting her name into the darkness, and the rest of us quickly joined him at the edge of the cornfield, our voices overlapping as we called for Allison. The corn seemed to absorb our shouts, muffling them into nothing, and all we could hear was our own breathing and the constant rustling of leaves brushing against each other in the breeze. 5 of us formed a line and walked into the field together, arms outstretched so we wouldn't lose each other, moving slowly through the rows while calling her name every few seconds. The stalks were so thick that even with our phone flashlights, we could only see maybe 2 feet ahead, and the leaves kept slapping against our faces and arms, leaving these thin scratches that stung with sweat. After 20 minutes of searching, we found her phone lying face down in the dirt between 2 rows, the screen cracked but still glowing with Jess's missed calls. And that's when the real panic set in because Allison would never leave her phone behind, not even as a joke. We spent the next 3 hours searching that field, our voices getting hoarse from screaming her name, stumbling through the endless rows until our phones started dying one by one. Noah was practically hyperventilating, convinced she'd fallen and hit her head somewhere, while Kayla kept insisting we should have heard something, anything, if Allison had gotten hurt or lost, because sound carries weird in cornfields, but it doesn't just disappear entirely. By 2 in the morning, someone finally convinced Noah to call 911, and within an hour, the place was swarming with sheriff's deputies, volunteer firefighters, and search and rescue teams with powerful floodlights that lit up sections of the field like daylight. They brought in thermal imaging equipment, thinking maybe she'd passed out somewhere in the corn, and 2 different K9 units that both tracked her scent about 30 feet into the field before losing it completely, which the handlers said almost never happens unless someone gets into a vehicle. The Brennans came out in their bathrobes, Allison's mother Claire collapsing against her husband when she realized her daughter wasn't just playing some elaborate prank, and the sound she made was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, this raw wail that seemed to echo across the entire property. When the sun came up around 6 that morning, they had over 50 people walking shoulder to shoulder through the cornfield in a grid pattern, marking each row with orange tape as they cleared it. That's when one of the deputies found the footprints, a single set of bare feet in the soft dirt that started about 40 feet from where we'd found the phone, which made no sense because Allison had been wearing these beat-up Converse sneakers with smiley faces she'd drawn on them in Sharpie. The prints were small, definitely hers based on the size, and they followed this bizarre path through the corn, weaving between rows seemingly at random, before making a sharp turn toward the gravel road that ran along the eastern edge of the property. The detective taking photos kept muttering about how clean the impressions were. No drag marks or signs of struggle. Just deliberate steps from someone who had apparently stopped to take off their shoes in the middle of a cornfield at night for no logical reason. They followed those prints for nearly a quarter mile, past the point where anyone at the bonfire could have possibly heard her, all the way to where the corn ended and the road began. At the edge of the road, the footprint simply stopped, right there in the middle of nothing. No car tracks in the gravel, no signs of anyone else having been there. Just this abrupt end like she'd stepped off the earth entirely. The forensics team photographed every print, measured the stride length, took soil samples, even brought in some specialist from the state police who'd worked missing persons cases for 20 years, and he stood there staring at those last few footprints for almost an hour without saying anything. Later, when the detective interviewed us individually at the station, he kept asking these specific questions about whether Allison had seemed different lately, whether she'd mentioned meeting anyone online, whether she'd ever talked about wanting to disappear, and it was clear they thought she'd planned this somehow. But those of us who knew her understood that was impossible, because Allison had just gotten accepted into the nursing program at the University of Iowa, had already paid her deposit, had spent the whole night talking about her classes starting in 2 weeks, and she'd never ever leave Noah without at least saying goodbye, not after they'd been together since sophomore year of high school. The thing that haunts me most happened 3 days after she disappeared, when the detective called us back to the station and showed us what they'd recovered from her phone. Most of it was normal stuff, texts about the bonfire, photos from earlier that night. But there was this recording that had started at 11:47 p.m., about 10 minutes after she'd walked into the corn, and it ran for nearly 2 hours before the battery died. The first few minutes were just rustling sounds and her breathing, normal enough, but then the breathing changed, became deeper and more rhythmic like she was walking with purpose, and you could hear her moving through the corn at a steady pace, never stumbling or stopping to look around. About 30 minutes in, there was this weird moment where the rustling stopped completely for maybe 10 seconds. Total silence except for her breathing, and then it resumed, but with this strange echo quality, like she was in a much larger space than just between corn rows. The detective played it for us on these high-end speakers, and we all heard it, this subtle shift in the acoustic quality that made no sense given where she was supposed to be. The really disturbing part came near the end of the recording, around the 90-minute mark, when you could hear what sounded like Allison humming this tune none of us recognized, just 5 or 6 notes repeated over and over. And her breathing had become so calm, it was almost like she was in some kind of trance. Then right before the phone died, there was this sound that made everyone in that room lean forward. A voice that was definitely Allison's, but speaking in this flat, emotionless tone, saying numbers. 4, 12, 37, 9, 22. Just random numbers with no pattern anyone could figure out. The FBI got involved at that point, running the audio through every kind of analysis, checking those numbers against everything from GPS coordinates to dates to code sequences, but they found nothing that made sense. Noah listened to that recording probably 100 times, convinced there was some message in it, some clue we were missing, until his parents finally made him stop because he wasn't sleeping anymore, just sitting in his room with headphones on, playing those numbers over and over. 2 weeks later, they found her shoes, both of them, placed neatly side by side on the shoulder of Highway 30, almost 15 miles from the Brennan property, sitting there like she'd just stepped out of them to walk barefoot down the asphalt. They were definitely hers, those Converse with the smiley faces, and they were clean. No mud or corn silk or anything that suggested they'd been in that field, which made no sense because we'd all seen her wearing them that night. The laces were still tied in her specific way, this double knot she always did because she hated when they came undone, and inside the left shoe was a receipt from a gas station none of us had ever heard of, time-stamped at 2:47 a.m. the night she disappeared, for a bottle of water and a pack of spearmint gum paid in cash. The detective drove out to that gas station, this little 24-hour place way out on some back road, and the night clerk remembered a girl matching Allison's description coming in around that time, but said she seemed perfectly normal, maybe a little quiet, and that she'd left on foot heading north even though he'd asked if she needed help finding something. What really messed with our heads was the security footage from that gas station, because it clearly showed Allison walking in at 2:46 a.m., barefoot and wearing the same clothes from the bonfire, moving with this strange, purposeful stride like she knew exactly where she was going. She bought the items, had a brief conversation with the clerk where she apparently told him she was going to see the Rose End, whatever that meant, and then walked out and turned north just like he'd said. The camera outside caught her walking along the edge of the road for about 30 seconds before she disappeared into the darkness, and that was the last confirmed sighting of her. The police searched every inch of ground between that gas station and where they'd found her shoes, brought in helicopters with infrared cameras, even drained a pond half a mile away, but found nothing else. No clothing, no footprints, no sign that Allison had ever been anywhere near that stretch of highway. The investigation went on for months, with detectives following every possible lead, interviewing anyone who'd had contact with Allison in the weeks before she disappeared, checking traffic cameras from every intersection within a 50-mile radius, but they never found another trace of her. They discovered she'd been researching weird stuff online in the days before the bonfire, agricultural patterns, and something called liminality in rural spaces, which turned out to be some academic paper about psychological effects of repetitive landscapes like cornfields. But her browser history was otherwise normal, just college stuff and music videos. Her parents hired a private investigator who spent 6 months retracing every step, even brought in some expert on missing persons who'd worked cases all over the Midwest. But he just confirmed what we already knew. People don't just vanish like this, walking barefoot out of a cornfield in the middle of the night with no explanation, no motive, no destination that anyone could identify. The hardest part was watching the Brennans slowly accept that their daughter might never come home, seeing them take down the missing person flyers as they weathered and faded, watching Noah transfer to a different school because he couldn't handle being in Cedar Rapids anymore. The cornfield is still there, though the Brennans don't plant it anymore, just let it go wild with prairie grass and weeds that grow taller each summer until you can barely tell it was ever cultivated land. Sometimes I drive past on my way to visit Jess's parents, and I always slow down at that spot where the field meets the road, wondering if maybe I'll see something everyone else missed, some clue that explains where Allison went that night. The gas station clerk quit his job a few months after she disappeared. Said he kept having dreams about a girl walking north into the darkness, and the new clerk doesn't know anything about it, just shrugs when people ask about the girl who came through that night talking about Rose Ending. Noah sent me a message last month. First time I'd heard from him in over a year, just a simple question. Do you ever hear those numbers in your head? And I knew exactly what he meant because sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I hear Allison's flat voice reciting them. 4, 12, 37, 9, 22, like she's still out there somewhere, walking barefoot through endless rows of corn, following some path only she can see. Jamie always came home at 3:45, give or take 2 minutes. I'd been timing him since the start of the school year, mostly out of boredom while I waited for my shift at the hardware store to start at 5. My younger brother was 14 and predictable as clockwork. You could set your watch by the sound of him kicking off his sneakers on the back porch. October had settled over our part of Illinois with unusual cold that year, and the acres of corn behind our house had turned that particular shade of brown that meant harvest was overdue. That Wednesday, I stood at the kitchen window eating a sandwich, watching the clock tick past 4, then 4:30, and Jamie never showed. Mom was still at the dentist's office where she worked reception, and Dad wouldn't be back from the plant until after 7. By 5:15, I'd already called the school twice, walked the road to check for accidents, and finally forced myself to face what I'd been avoiding, checking the shortcut through the corn that Jamie had been using since 6th grade. My brother treated that field like his personal highway, cutting 20 minutes off his walk home every single day. He knew every deer trail, every irrigation pipe, every spot where the rows opened into small clearings. I found his entry point immediately, the same gap near the rusted fence post where he always ducked in, his handprints visible in the orange rust from years of grabbing it for balance. His footprints were fresh in the soft dirt, those beat-up Converse with the loose heel leaving their familiar marks. I followed them for about 30 yards before backing out and calling 911, trying to keep my voice steady while explaining that my brother hadn't come home. Within an hour, we had 3 sheriff's deputies tramping through our kitchen, tracking mud everywhere while Deputy Coleman explained his theory about spatial disorientation in tall crops. He said it like he was reading from a manual, like Jamie hadn't spent 4 years learning every landmark in those 200 acres, like my brother was some city kid who'd never seen corn before. They searched until midnight that first night, brought in dogs the next morning, even used a drone with thermal imaging on Friday. Nothing. The dogs tracked Jamie's scent for maybe 300 yards into the field before losing it completely, like he'd just vanished into thin air. The handler, a woman named Cheryl with deep wrinkles around her eyes, kept making her German Shepherd go back to the same spot, clearly frustrated that the trail just stopped. She asked me 3 times if there were any old wells or storm cellars in the field, and each time I told her no, just corn and dirt and more corn. The thermal drone picked up plenty of deer, a few coyotes, but no heat signature that could be Jamie. Sheriff Garrett held a press conference on Saturday talking about ongoing search efforts, while basically telling everyone that kids sometimes run away, that the corn made it hard to find anyone, that we needed to consider all possibilities. Mom stopped sleeping after that, just sat at the kitchen table staring at Jamie's school photo, while Dad drove around checking abandoned barns and talking to farmers within a 10-mile radius. By Monday, a week after Jamie disappeared, the official search was scaled back to routine patrols. I couldn't stand the waiting anymore, couldn't stand how everyone was starting to talk about my brother in past tense. That morning, after my parents left, Mom to put up more flyers, Dad to check the bus station in Peoria again, I went back to the field alone. The cops had trampled the original trail, but I knew Jamie's patterns well enough to guess his likely route. He always veered left after entering the field, following a slight ridge that kept his feet drier when the ground was muddy. I pushed through the corn, ignoring how the dry leaves cut at my arms, counting my paces like Jamie had taught me when we were kids playing hide and seek. At around 400 yards in, well past where the dogs had lost his scent, I found something the searchers had missed, a partial footprint, just the toe of his Converse preserved under a fallen cornstalk. The angle was wrong though, like he'd been walking backwards or spinning around, and the dirt around it had strange marks, almost like something had been dragged, but not quite. I kept following the disturbed earth, crawling on my knees now to see under the bent stalks, and that's when I spotted it. Jamie's backpack sitting perfectly upright against a cornstalk like someone had carefully placed it there. Not thrown, not dropped, but set down deliberately with the zippers all closed and the straps adjusted evenly. My brother was messy, always tossing his stuff around, never zipped anything properly in his life. The backpack was clean too, no dirt or moisture on it despite sitting there for a week. Inside, everything was arranged wrong. His textbooks stacked by size, his pencils all facing the same direction in their case, his half-eaten bag of chips folded closed and paper-clipped. Jamie didn't even own paper clips. About 10 feet away, positioned exactly parallel to the corn rows, I found his left shoe. Just one shoe, laces still tied in Jamie's weird double-knot style, but the shoe itself was pristine, like someone had wiped it clean before placing it there. The sock was tucked inside, folded into a perfect little square. The trail of disturbed soil continued for another 20 yards past the shoe, and I followed it, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it over the wind rattling the corn. The marks in the dirt were deliberate, not random drag patterns, but almost like symbols or letters, though I couldn't make sense of them. They led to a small clearing where several corn stalks had been bent down in a rough circle, their tops woven together overhead to form a kind of shelter or blind. Inside this space, the ground was completely smooth, swept clean of any debris or footprints. In the exact center, someone had dug a shallow depression, maybe 6 inches deep and perfectly round. The extracted dirt formed into a neat ring around it. At the bottom of the depression lay Jamie's student ID card, his house key, and 3 pennies from his pocket, arranged in a triangle. The plastic ID wasn't scratched or dirty. It looked like someone had polished it. But what made me stumble backward was what I saw pressed into the smooth dirt around these items. Dozens of footprints, all from the same shoe, all exactly the same depth, forming a spiral pattern that wound inward to the center. They were Jamie's prints from his right shoe, the one still on his foot. I ran back to the house, crashing through the corn rows without caring about the cuts on my arms, and called Sheriff Garrett directly. This time I had evidence, something concrete they couldn't dismiss as teenage runaway behavior. Garrett himself came out with 2 detectives from the state police, and I led them to the clearing, my legs shaking the whole way. They took photos of everything, bagged the items, made casts of the footprints, but I could see the confusion on their faces. Detective Mills kept asking if I was sure I hadn't touched anything, if maybe Jamie had made this himself as some kind of prank or cry for attention. I wanted to scream at him that Jamie wasn't that kind of kid, that someone had taken my brother and arranged his things like trophies. They brought in a forensics team that afternoon, and that's when things got even stranger. The footprint spiral showed Jamie had walked it at least 30 times, based on the depth and overlap, but there were no other prints anywhere, not even partials. Whoever had been with him had either never touched the ground or had carefully erased their tracks while leaving Jamie's intact. The forensics tech, a young guy named Bradley who looked fresh from college, pulled me aside while the others were documenting the scene. He showed me something on his tablet, enhanced photos of the dirt marks I'd thought might be symbols. Under magnification, they weren't random at all. They were measurements, precise distances marked in the soil, all pointing to different spots in the field. Bradley had mapped them, and they formed a grid pattern extending out from the clearing in perfectly straight lines, each endpoint exactly 150 feet from the center. He asked if Jamie was good at math, if he might have been interested in surveying or geometry. I told him Jamie could barely pass algebra, that he couldn't measure anything without messing it up. Bradley just nodded and went back to the others, but I saw him taking more photos, making notes in a separate notebook he didn't share with the detectives. Before they left, he slipped me a piece of paper with his number, told me to call if I found anything else, anything at all that seemed arranged or measured. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the grid pattern Bradley had shown me. After my parents went to bed, Mom finally knocked out by sleeping pills. Dad passed out on the couch still wearing his work boots. I grabbed a compass and measuring tape from the garage and went back to the field. The moon was nearly full, giving just enough light to navigate between the corn rows without a flashlight that might alert the neighbors. I found the clearing again and started checking Bradley's measurements, following the grid lines out to their endpoints. At the first marker, exactly 150 feet north of the clearing, I found another small depression in the ground, this one containing Jamie's calculator watch, the band cut cleanly in half. The second point to the east had his gym whistle on its lanyard. tied in a complex knot I'd never seen before. Each endpoint had something of Jamie's, all items he would have had with him that day, all placed with the same obsessive precision. The western point made me stop breathing for a full 10 seconds. There, arranged in a perfect line, were Jamie's baby teeth, the ones Mom had saved in a little box in her jewelry drawer. All 12 of them, spaced exactly 1 inch apart, pressed into the soil so only their tops were visible. How could anyone have known about those teeth? How could they have gotten into our house, into Mom's room, without us noticing? I started digging frantically around the teeth, my fingers clawing at the dirt, and about 6 inches down, I hit something solid. It was Jamie's phone, wrapped in clear plastic, the screen still showing his last text to me from that Wednesday. Home in 20, save me some pizza. The battery was dead, but the phone was perfectly clean inside its wrapping, like someone had sealed it away for safekeeping. Underneath the phone, pressed into the clay, was a single adult footprint, not a shoe print, but a bare foot, with unusually long toes, and what looked like a 6th toe's impression on the left side. The print was deep, deeper than my own when I stood next to it, suggesting someone much heavier despite the narrow shape of the foot. I called Bradley from the field, whispering into my phone while crouched in the corn. He answered on the second ring, like he'd been waiting for my call, and when I told him about the baby teeth and the footprint, he went silent for so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Then he told me to take photos of everything but not to call the sheriff yet. He said he'd been doing some research, checking through old missing persons cases in the area, and he'd found something. 3 other kids had vanished in cornfields over the past 15 years, all within a 50-mile radius, all in October, all between the ages of 12 and 15. The cases had never been connected because they happened in different counties, different jurisdictions, but the pattern was there. Each time the official search found nothing, dogs lost the trail, and the kids were written off as runaways. Bradley had driven out to one of the old sites that afternoon, a field near Effingham that had since been developed into a subdivision. The construction crew had found strange things when they cleared the land, items arranged in geometric patterns, footprints that didn't match any of the workers, and according to one foreman Bradley had tracked down, a complex tunnel system that didn't appear on any survey maps. The southern grid point was the last one I checked, and I almost wished I hadn't. There, in a shallow hole covered with carefully arranged corn husks, was a stack of photographs. They were all of Jamie, taken over the course of months, maybe years. Jamie walking to school, Jamie in our backyard, Jamie through his bedroom window. Some were so recent I recognized the clothes, the shirt he'd worn the previous week, the jacket he'd gotten for his birthday in September. But others were older, showing Jamie at 12, at 10, even one that looked like it was taken when he was maybe 7 or 8, at a school field day I barely remembered. Whoever had taken these had been watching my brother for half his life, had been in our neighborhood, near our house, close enough to photograph him through windows. At the bottom of the stack was a hand-drawn map of our property and the cornfield, marked with dates and times, noting Jamie's routes and routines with terrifying accuracy. The final notation, written in small, precise handwriting, was for that Wednesday, 3:15 p.m., intercept at position 7. Position 7 was marked deep in the field, right around where the dogs had lost Jamie's scent. Bradley arrived at the field 40 minutes later with ground-penetrating radar equipment he'd borrowed from the university. We worked in silence, scanning the area around position 7. And just before dawn, the equipment detected an anomaly, a void about 8 feet underground, extending horizontally for at least 20 feet before the signal degraded. Bradley called in favors, got a full FBI team out there by noon, told them about the pattern of disappearances, the photographs, everything. They brought in excavation equipment, and by evening they'd broken through into a narrow tunnel, hand-dug and reinforced with scavenged materials, leading to a series of small chambers carved from the clay. The smell that came up from that hole, earth and something else, something organic and wrong, made everyone step back. The FBI sent in a robot with a camera first, and when they saw what was down there, They cleared everyone out except essential personnel. They found Jamie alive in the third chamber, semi-conscious and dehydrated but breathing, along with 2 other kids, a girl from Champaign who'd gone missing 3 weeks earlier, and a boy from Decatur whose parents had reported him as a runaway 6 days ago. The man they arrested lived alone in a farmhouse 4 miles away, had worked as a surveyor for the county 20 years ago, before an injury left him on disability. Harold Jenks, 63 years old, 6'4", with a birth defect that gave him an extra toe on his left foot. He'd been using the tunnel system for over a decade, expanding it each year, accessing it through hidden entrances in 3 different cornfields. The FBI found journals in his house, thousands of pages documenting his observations of children, his selection process, his careful planning. He wrote about keeping them underground during the harvest season, when the noise of machinery would mask any sounds, then moving them through the tunnels to different locations, always staying ahead of the searches. Jamie doesn't remember much. Jenks had drugged him with something that affected his memory, made him compliant enough to walk that spiral pattern over and over, while Jenks watched from a blind he'd built in the corn. The other kids had similar gaps in their memories, just fragments of darkness and the sound of corn rustling overhead. Jenks pleaded guilty to avoid trial, got life without parole, and never explained why he did it beyond saying the fields told him to. Jamie came home after a week in the hospital, physically okay but different, quieter. He hasn't walked through a cornfield since, takes the long way to school now, stays on the sidewalks and paved roads. The field behind our house was harvested that November, and Dad convinced the owner to plant soybeans the next year, then wheat, anything but corn. We never talk about it, but sometimes I catch Jamie staring out his bedroom window at where the cornfield used to be, and I wonder what he's remembering, what fragments of those dark hours underground still surface in his dreams. The fence posts stretched for miles across that Nebraska property, each one needing new wire, or a complete replacement after the spring storms had torn through. I'd been picking up mechanic work at a shop in Omaha for about 6 months, when Jerry, one of the regulars, mentioned his uncle needed someone handy for a week-long job out in the country. The pay was double what I was making, cash up front, plus room and board at the farmhouse. My beat-up Chevy truck needed new tires and the rent was overdue, so I loaded my tools that Sunday morning and drove 3 hours west into nowhere. The land out there was different than anything I'd seen growing up near Denver, just endless fields of corn already standing 7 feet tall in early July, broken only by gravel roads that seemed to lead nowhere special. Walter Hoffman turned out to be somewhere past 70, with fingers bent from arthritis, and a way of squinting at you like he was trying to read fine print. His farmhouse sat alone on 800 acres, the nearest neighbor a good 4 miles down the county road. He showed me to a small room above the garage, just a mattress and a dresser that smelled like motor oil, then walked me along the fence line that needed fixing. The corn grew right up to the posts in most places, leaving these narrow corridors where I'd have to work, barely wide enough to swing a hammer. Walter said he'd planted late this year because of the rain, and the stalks were growing fast in the heat, already thick enough that you couldn't see more than a few feet into the rows. He'd leave me alone during the day, he explained, since his hip made walking hard, but dinner would be ready at 6 sharp in the main house. The first 3 days went smooth enough, just me and the fence posts under that Nebraska sun, sweat dripping while I hammered new boards and stretched wire until my arms burned. The only sounds were the meadowlarks calling from somewhere beyond the corn and this constant rustling the wind made pushing through all those leaves. Sometimes I'd catch myself stopping work just to listen to it, that ocean sound of thousands of stalks swaying together, almost hypnotic if you let it get to you. Around Wednesday afternoon, I was working a section near the back of the property when I heard something else mixed in with that rustling. Footsteps, deliberate and measured, moving through the rows about 20 yards from where I was kneeling with my pliers. I stood up and called out, thinking maybe Walter had walked out to check on my progress, but the footsteps stopped immediately, leaving just that endless whisper of corn moving in the breeze. That night at dinner, I asked Walter if anyone else ever came through the property. Maybe hunters or kids from town looking for trouble. He stopped cutting his pork chop and gave me that squinting look again, like I'd asked something peculiar. Nobody had any business being on his land, he said, and nobody from town would drive all the way out here just to walk through corn. The way he said it made me feel stupid for asking, so I dropped it and focused on my plate. But when I was walking back to my room above the garage, I noticed how complete the darkness was out there. No streetlights, no house lights except Walter's windows, just stars and the massive shadow of the cornfield surrounding everything. My truck sat parked by the garage, and on impulse I tried starting it just to hear the engine. But when I turned the key, nothing happened except a clicking sound from under the hood. The battery was dead, completely drained even though I'd just driven it 3 days ago without any problems. I popped the hood with my phone flashlight since the garage had no overhead light, and everything looked normal. No loose cables, no corrosion on the terminals. I figured I'd ask Walter for a jump in the morning, but when I checked my phone to set an alarm, the screen showed no signal bars at all. Not even one. I'd had at least 2 bars the first day, enough to text my roommate that I'd arrived safely. Now the phone was basically a brick, useless except as a flashlight. Standing there between my dead truck and that wall of corn just 30 feet away, I felt this weight settle in my chest, like when you realize you've made a mistake but can't quite name what it is yet. The corn rustled louder in the night breeze, and I swear I heard those same measured footsteps again, closer this time, maybe just inside the first row of stalks. Friday morning came with fog so thick I couldn't see the cornfield from my window. Just white mist pressed against the glass like cotton. I found Walter in his kitchen already drinking coffee, and when I mentioned my truck trouble, he said his battery charger had broken last month, and he hadn't gotten around to replacing it. The nearest auto parts store was in town, 40 minutes away, and he couldn't drive me there until Monday, when he did his supply run. 3 more days stuck here. I asked about using his landline to call someone, maybe Jerry back in Omaha, but Walter said the phone lines went down in the last storm, and the phone company hadn't come out yet. His words made sense, but something in his tone felt rehearsed, like he'd been expecting these exact questions. I spent that day working the fence, but now every sound from the corn made me stop and stare into those green walls, trying to see between the stalks. That Friday night changed everything. I was lying on the mattress above the garage, windows open because the heat was suffocating when I heard the footsteps again. But this time, they weren't staying in the corn. They were moving along the fence line I'd been repairing, slow and deliberate, occasionally stopping right where I'd been working hours before. I crept to the window and looked down, but the darkness was absolute beyond the small circle of light from Walter's porch bulb. Then I heard the fence wire snap, that distinct metallic twang of tension releasing, followed by another snap, then another. Someone was cutting through my work, destroying what I'd spent days fixing. I grabbed my phone for light and rushed downstairs, but by the time I reached the fence, the footsteps had retreated back into the corn. 3 sections of new wire hung loose, cleanly cut with what must have been wire cutters. The cuts were precise, deliberate, not random vandalism, but something purposeful. Walter barely looked up from his eggs when I told him Saturday morning about the cut fence. Kids from town, he said, probably the same ones who'd been stealing gas from farms all summer. But his hands trembled slightly as he lifted his coffee mug, and I noticed he kept glancing toward the windows that faced the cornfield. I spent the morning repairing the damaged sections, jumping at every rustle, every bird call. Around noon, I decided to walk the perimeter of the property, looking for tire tracks or footprints, anything that might explain who was doing this. The corn rows ran along 3 sides of Walter's land, with only the front facing the county road clear. As I walked along the eastern edge, where the stalks grew thickest, I found something that made me stop cold. A narrow path cut into the corn, barely visible unless you were looking straight at it. The stalks had been carefully pushed aside, not broken, creating a tunnel that disappeared into the green darkness. Fresh boot prints marked the entrance, the treads still sharp in the dry soil. I stood at that entrance for a long time, listening to the corn move around me, trying to convince myself to follow that path and see where it led. But something primal in my gut screamed against it. Whoever made that trail knew these fields, had probably been using them for weeks or months, maybe longer. They could be waiting in there just far enough and where the light barely reached, watching the entrance. Instead, I backed away and continued my circuit around the property, finding 2 more hidden paths cut into different sections of the field. All of them angled toward the house and garage, like spokes on a wheel with Walter's buildings at the center. That afternoon, I confronted Walter directly, told him about the paths, said someone was definitely living or hiding in his corn. His face went pale, almost gray, and he gripped the kitchen table hard enough that his knuckles went white. Then he told me something that made everything worse. The corn wasn't his. He'd leased those fields to a company 5 years ago, some agricultural outfit from Kansas City, and they planted and harvested without his involvement. He had no idea who worked those fields or when they came through. Saturday night, I barricaded myself in the room above the garage, pushing the dresser against the door and keeping a hammer within reach. Sleep was impossible. Every sound became footsteps. Every gust of wind sounded like breathing. Around midnight, I heard voices, low, muffled, but definitely human, coming from somewhere near the garage. I pressed my ear to the floor and could make out at least 2 different speakers, maybe 3, but couldn't understand the words. They were directly below me in the garage with my dead truck. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes. Then footsteps scattered in different directions, some heading back toward the corn, others moving toward the main house where Walter slept. I watched from my window as a shadow passed through the porch light's glow, tall, wearing what looked like coveralls, carrying something long in one hand. The figure stopped at Walter's front door, stood there for a full minute, then walked back toward the cornfield, disappearing into one of those hidden paths. Sunday morning, Walter wasn't in the kitchen at his usual time. I found him sitting on his porch, staring at the cornfield with hollow eyes, looking like he hadn't slept at all. When I sat down beside him, he started talking without prompting, his voice barely above a whisper. The company that leased his fields, he said. They'd stopped sending checks 2 years ago, stopped answering his calls, but people still came to work the corn. Different people each season, arriving in unmarked vans, never talking to him, never asking permission. He'd tried calling the police once, but the sheriff said without proof of trespassing or crime, there was nothing to investigate. The workers had keys to the equipment shed behind the corn, legal access roads through neighboring properties. Walter suspected they were growing more than corn in those fields, using the dense rows to hide other activities, maybe drugs, maybe worse. He'd been too scared to look closer, too old to fight back, so he just stayed in his house and pretended not to notice when they came through at night. I told Walter we were leaving immediately, both of us that morning. We could walk to the county road and flag down a car if we had to. But he shook his head, said they'd never let us leave on foot, not in daylight when they could see us from the corn. Our only chance was his truck Monday morning, acting like nothing was wrong, like it was just his regular supply run. Until then, we had to play along, pretend we didn't know anything. That Sunday crawled by in suffocating tension, both of us going through the motions, me pretending to work on the fence, Walter puttering around his yard, both of us avoiding looking at the corn even as we felt eyes watching from within. As darkness fell, Walter handed me his truck keys and an old revolver he'd kept hidden. Only 3 bullets left in the cylinder. He told me to be ready at dawn, to get to his truck fast when he gave the signal. We'd make a run for town and never come back. That night they came for my truck. I watched from my window as 4 figures emerged from different paths in the corn, converging on the garage below. They worked in complete silence, no talking, just efficient movement as they pushed my truck out of the garage and down toward the cornfield. They were taking it somewhere into those rows, probably to strip it for parts or hide it where no one would ever find it. One of them looked up at my window before they disappeared, just stood there staring at where I was hiding behind the curtain, making sure I knew they knew exactly where I was. I gripped Walter's revolver tighter and waited for them to come upstairs, but after a few minutes the figure turned and followed the others into the corn. The message was clear. We were allowed to leave in the morning, but only because they decided to let us go. They owned this place now, not Walter, and everyone involved understood the terms. Monday came with a blood-red sunrise that painted the corn stalks orange. Walter was already in his truck when I sprinted from the garage, expecting someone to emerge from the fields at any moment. But nothing moved except the corn swaying in the morning breeze. We drove down that gravel drive faster than was safe, dust clouding behind us, neither of us speaking until we hit the paved county road. Walter drove straight to the state police station in Grand Island, told them everything while I sat there still clutching his revolver in my jacket pocket. The cops sent units out that afternoon, but they found nothing. No paths in the corn, no footprints, no sign of my truck. Even the cut fence wires had been replaced with new ones. The detective said without evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Walter sold the farm 2 months later to some development company from out of state, took whatever they offered and moved to Arizona to live with his daughter. I never got my truck back, never got paid for the fence work either. Sometimes I search online for news about that area of Nebraska, looking for stories about drug busts or missing persons found in cornfields, but there's never anything. Whatever they were doing out there in those endless rows, they're probably still doing it now, using some other old farmer's land, watching from the corn. October brings out the worst in people, and after working at Frightland Farms for 6 weeks, I thought I'd seen it all. College was draining my bank account faster than my parents predicted, so when I saw the Help Wanted sign for the corn maze back in September, $30 an hour seemed too good to pass up. The maze sprawled across 12 acres of farmland just outside Bakersfield, with walls of corn stalks reaching 8 feet high, and paths that twisted into dead ends designed to make visitors panic. My job was simple enough. Reset the motion-activated props between tours, guide lost families to the exit, and make sure nobody vandalized the animatronic scarecrows. That particular Saturday night, we'd run 7 tours back-to-back, each one packed with screaming teenagers and drunk adults who thought jumping out at other guests was hilarious. By the time we locked the main gate at midnight, my ears were ringing from all the chainsaw sound effects, and dried corn silk had worked its way into every piece of clothing I wore. The parking lot emptied out quickly after closing, leaving just 3 cars: mine, the manager Keith's pickup truck, and a sedan that belonged to Vicky from concessions. Keith had asked me and 2 other guys to stay late for breakdown duty, promising an extra $50 cash if we helped haul the expensive decorations into storage before the rain forecasted for Sunday morning. Most of the electronic stuff needed to come down first: the strobe lights, fog machines, and those motion sensors that triggered recorded screams whenever someone walked past. The other guys started at the entrance while I headed toward the back sections with a wheelbarrow and my phone flashlight, since the overhead lights would shut off automatically at 12:30 to save electricity. The corn rustled in the wind, creating whispers that made me jumpy even though I knew every inch of these paths. I'd just disconnected the zombie mannequin at checkpoint 4 when the first section of lights went dark, way earlier than scheduled. Then the second section cut out, and the third like someone was flipping breakers in sequence, leaving me stranded in complete darkness, with nothing but my phone's weak beam cutting through the shadows. "Keith," I called out, expecting to hear his gravelly voice boom back from the entrance, but nothing came except the sound of corn stalks brushing against each other. The generator should have kicked in by now. We had backup power specifically for situations like this, installed after some kids got lost in the dark 2 years ago, and their parents threatened to sue. I tried calling Keith's cell, but the screen showed no signal, which wasn't unusual since reception was spotty out here, but the timing made my chest tight. That's when I heard it, a voice answering from somewhere deep in the maze, muffled by the walls of corn but definitely human. "Yeah, coming," it said, but something was wrong with the tone, Too high-pitched to be Keith, too cheerful for anyone who'd just worked a 12-hour shift. The voice had that fake quality actors use when they're trying too hard to sound casual, like someone reading lines for the first time. I aimed my phone toward where the sound came from, but the light barely penetrated 5 feet before the darkness swallowed it whole. My first instinct was to head back toward the entrance, but the path behind me looked identical to the one ahead, just walls of corn pressing in from both sides. We'd designed the maze to disorient people during daylight hours, and now, in pitch darkness with my phone battery at 30%, every turn looked the same. Another sound cut through the rustling, and this time it was definitely laughter. Not from the speakers we'd installed at corner posts, but from somewhere between the rows, like someone was standing just behind the corn wall next to me. The laugh had that unhinged quality drunk people get when they think they're being funny, but they're really just being creepy, drawn out, and ending in a wheeze. "Real hilarious, guys," I shouted, figuring it was probably Brett and Miguel trying to mess with me, but my voice cracked halfway through. The laughter stopped immediately, replaced by footsteps, not on the packed dirt paths, but pushing through the corn itself, snapping stalks as whoever it was forced their way through the walls instead of using the maze routes. The wheelbarrow I'd been pushing sat abandoned behind me somewhere, and I couldn't remember which checkpoint I'd passed last. Every horror movie I'd ever watched screamed at me not to investigate, to just run, but running blind through a maze designed to trap people seemed equally stupid. My phone flashlight started flickering, not dying completely but stuttering like a strobe light, which made the shadows between the corn rows jump and dance. During one of the dark moments, I caught a glimpse of something pale moving parallel to me through the stalks, keeping pace but never quite showing itself fully. The smell hit me then, not the earthy scent of corn and soil I'd gotten used to, but something chemical and wrong, like rubber burning mixed with that sickly sweet stench of spilled energy drinks. Whoever this was had been here a while, maybe since before we opened for the evening tours, waiting in some corner we never checked. The thought made bile rise in my throat because we'd had hundreds of people walk through here tonight, including families with little kids, and this person had been watching the whole time. I forced myself to think logically about the maze layout. The exit was always northeast from any point. That's how we'd mapped it for emergency situations. But without the overhead lights or the glowing arrows we put up for the younger kids' tours, northeast meant nothing. The footsteps had stopped, which somehow felt worse than hearing them because now I had no idea where the person was. Then my phone started ringing, the sound impossibly loud in the silence, Keith's name lighting up the screen. Relief flooded through me as I answered, but the voice that came through wasn't Keith's. "Having fun yet?" the same high-pitched voice from earlier asked, and I realized with cold certainty that whoever was in here with me had Keith's phone. The line went dead before I could respond, and when I looked at my screen, my battery had dropped to 20%, even though it had been at 30 just minutes ago. The corn to my left suddenly parted, stalks bending outward like something large was pushing through, and I saw fingers, too long with dirt caked under the nails, reaching through the gap toward where I stood. I stumbled backward and ran, not caring anymore about finding the exit, just needing to put distance between me and those reaching fingers. The maze paths forked and twisted, and I took turns at random, my breath coming in ragged gasps that echoed off the corn walls. Behind me, I could hear pursuit, not running but walking steadily, calmly, like whoever it was knew exactly where I would end up. They started whistling, the tune familiar but wrong, like a children's song played in a minor key. My phone light caught a reflection ahead, metal gleaming in the darkness, and I recognized one of our emergency exit signs, the ones we installed after the lawsuit threat. The gate was padlocked, of course, but the fence was only 6 feet high, chain link that I could climb if I could just reach it. 20 more yards, 15, 10, and then something wrapped around my ankle, sending me sprawling face first into the dirt path. When I rolled over, gasping and spitting out soil, I saw what had tripped me. A foam machete from one of our props, but attached to it was a note written in what looked like brown marker. "You walked past me 17 times tonight." The whistling had stopped, and in the sudden quiet, I heard something that made my situation infinitely worse. Multiple voices, at least 3, maybe 4, all whispering in unison from different parts of the maze. They were coordinating, I realized, using the paths to herd me towards something. My phone finally died, plunging me into absolute darkness just as I heard the chain link fence rattle somewhere to my right. They were climbing it, blocking my escape route. The whispering grew louder and I could make out words now. Section 3 clear. He's moving toward checkpoint 7. Block the maintenance gate. These weren't random creeps who'd hidden after hours. They'd studied our maze, learned our procedures, maybe even taken one of our employee maps from the break room. The smell was stronger now, and I realized why it seemed familiar. It was the same combination of smells from the storage unit where we kept the old decorations, the ones from 5 years ago when an employee named Curtis had disappeared during breakdown and never been found. We joked about it sometimes, called it the Curtis curse, but right now, crouched in the dirt with strangers surrounding me, I wondered if maybe Curtis hadn't disappeared at all. The ground beneath me vibrated slightly, and I heard the unmistakable sound of our industrial wood chipper starting up somewhere near the maintenance shed. We used it to mulch the corn stalks after the season ended, but hearing it now, in the dark with these people hunting me, sent ice through my veins. They weren't just trying to scare me. They had access to our equipment, knew where we kept the keys. A flashlight beam suddenly cut through the darkness about 50 feet away, sweeping back and forth methodically. And in its glow, I saw a figure wearing one of our employee uniforms from years ago. The old green ones we'd replaced with red ones 3 seasons back. The person holding the light was tall, skeletal thin, with hair that hung in greasy strands over their face. When they turned slightly, I caught a glimpse of their smile, too wide, showing too many teeth like they'd been practicing it in a mirror but couldn't quite get it right. "Found you," they sang out in that high-pitched voice, and 2 more flashlights clicked on from different directions, forming a triangle with me at the center. Something inside me snapped then, not breaking but hardening into pure survival instinct. I grabbed handful after handful of dirt and started throwing it at the nearest flashlight, then dove through the corn wall to my left, not caring about the stalks cutting my face and arms. The corn rows weren't planted in perfect lines. There were gaps if you knew where to look, spaces where the irrigation system created natural corridors. I'd spent 6 weeks learning every inch of this place, and now that knowledge was the only thing keeping me alive. Behind me, I heard them crashing through the corn, no longer coordinated, angry now. The wood chipper's sound grew louder as I headed toward it, which seemed insane, but I remembered something. The maintenance shed had a landline, an old phone that connected directly to the security company. If I could get there first, if I could lock myself in and make that call, maybe I'd survive this. The shed appeared in the darkness, a darker shadow against the night sky, and I could see the door was open, swinging slightly in the wind. The smart thing would be to avoid it, to know it was a trap, but I could hear them getting closer, and the sound of the wood chipper meant someone was already there, waiting. I burst through the shed door and immediately saw Keith, tied to a chair with orange extension cords, duct tape over his mouth, his eyes wide with terror, but alive. The wood chipper sat in the corner, running empty, just making noise to lure me here. Before I could move toward Keith, the door slammed shut behind me, and the skeletal figure stepped out from behind a stack of fertilizer bags. Up close, I could see their face clearly. Hollow cheeks, eyes that didn't blink enough, and that horrible smile that looked carved into their face. "You lasted longer than Curtis," they said in that sing-song voice, pulling something from their pocket that gleamed silver in the dim light from the emergency exit sign. It was a set of keys. Car keys, house keys, and smaller keys I recognized as the ones from our employee lockers. Dozens of sets, all on different rings, some rusty, some new, and I understood with sickening clarity that Curtis wasn't there first, and I wouldn't be there last. They took a step toward me, and I grabbed the first thing I could reach, a canister of pesticide spray we used for wasp nests. The label warned about eye contact, about permanent damage, about keeping away from open flames, and I remembered the lighter in my pocket from my smoke break 6 hours ago, back when my biggest worry was a statistics midterm. What happened next took maybe 10 seconds, but I can still see every detail when I close my eyes. I sprayed the pesticide directly at their face while flicking the lighter with my other hand, creating a makeshift flamethrower that sent them stumbling backward, screaming in a voice that finally sounded human. The others burst through the door just as the pesticide canister emptied, and in the chaos, I managed to cut Keith free with a box cutter from the workbench. We ran toward his truck while they tried to help their leader, whose face was a mess of chemical burns and singed hair. Keith's hands shook so badly I had to dig the keys from his pocket myself, and we peeled out of there, gravel spraying, while 3 figures stood in the parking lot watching us go. The police found evidence of at least 12 different people who'd gone missing from corn mazes across 3 states over the past 8 years, all during the Halloween season. They arrested 4 people living in an abandoned farmhouse 2 miles from Frightland Farms, and during the trial, we learned they'd been employees at various mazes over the years, learning layouts, studying procedures, choosing victims who stayed late. The wood chipper had been cleaned with bleach so many times the metal was pitted, but forensics still found traces. I finished college, got my degree, moved to Portland where there's no farmland for miles, but every October when the leaves change and people start decorating for Halloween, I smell that mixture of burnt rubber and energy drinks, and I remember those fingers reaching through the corn. The Corn Maze Festival had always been the highlight of autumn in our town. Families came from neighboring counties to eat fried dough, take hay rides, and get lost among the tall golden rows that stretched beyond the church steeple. I helped with parking that year, waving cars toward the muddy field behind the grain silo. It was supposed to be an ordinary weekend. Warm cider, local bands, kids running with flashlights through the stalks. No one imagined that before the night was over, a 17-year-old named Tyler Green would vanish without a trace. I remember hearing his name for the first time over the loudspeaker. The announcer's voice cracked halfway through, like he did not quite believe what he was saying. People laughed at first, thinking it was a prank. Tyler had entered the maze around 6 in the evening with 3 friends, and by dusk, he had separated from them. They assumed he went out another exit, but when the fireworks started at 9, his parents realized he was not anywhere near the crowd. That is when the panic began to spread through the fairgrounds, quiet at first, like wind stirring the stalks before a storm. By midnight, the sheriff's deputies had blocked the roads leading to the farms, and volunteers were forming lines at the edge of the maze. I joined them, holding a lantern borrowed from my father's shed. The smell of wet earth and gasoline filled the air. Every few yards, someone shouted Tyler's name, and the sound was swallowed by the corn. Flashlights danced through the fog, catching glimpses of scarecrows, boots half buried in mud, and once, a child's lost mitten that made a woman scream before realizing it was pink, not blue like Tyler's. The search stretched into the early hours, and the field began to feel endless. When the sun rose, we saw how far we had wandered. The maze sat between 3 farms, their property lines marked by rusted wire and piles of rotting hay. A man named Roger Jenkins brought coffee in a thermos and pointed to tire tracks near the drainage ditch. He said they were fresh, still pressed deep into the mud from the night before. The sheriff crouched beside them, tracing the pattern with a stick, and his face tightened. Word spread fast that the tread matched a pickup belonging to Tyler's neighbor, a quiet mechanic named Paul Hewitt. By noon, no one was talking about an accident anymore. The sheriff questioned Paul right there at the field, his wife standing behind him, arms folded tight against the morning chill. Paul kept saying he had gone home early, that his truck had not left the driveway since supper time. But everyone in town knew his tires. He used a distinctive snow tread year-round, claiming it gave him better traction in mud. While deputies searched his property, the rest of us stayed behind, combing through the maze row by row. Around mid-afternoon, one of the volunteer teams radioed that they had found a roll of duct tape half buried under a pile of stalks. It looked like it had been torn in a hurry, silver edges still sticky with dirt and grass. After that, everything changed. The fairgrounds that had been filled with chatter went dead silent, except for the sound of engines starting as more people joined the search. The duct tape was placed in a plastic bag and carried toward the sheriff's car like it was made of glass. A deputy muttered something about fingerprints and another pointed toward a broken flashlight lying a few yards away. Someone swore they had seen that same brand in Paul's garage last week. By then, everyone's face had turned pale, and whispers replaced words. It felt as if the entire town was holding its breath, afraid of what would come next. Later that evening, the sky turned a strange amber color, the kind you see before heavy rain. The wind made the corn hiss and shift, creating shapes that looked like people moving between the rows. We kept walking in lines, calling Tyler's name, but it started to sound meaningless. Some of the older men brought dogs, though the animals refused to go near the northern edge of the field. That was where we found the torn piece of blue fabric caught on a barbed wire fence. It matched the color of the hoodie Tyler had been wearing. The air around us felt heavy, and no one said a word as the sheriff wrapped it in another evidence bag. When night came again, the searchlights turned the field into a sea of shadows. The sheriff ordered everyone back to the fairgrounds to regroup, but a few of us stayed behind near the drainage ditch, where the tire marks had been found. That was when Roger noticed something in the water, a small silver chain tangled around a branch. It had a pendant shaped like a baseball, and Tyler's mother confirmed later that it belonged to him. The sheriff looked more exhausted than I had ever seen him. He said they would start digging near the ditch at first light. I went home that night muddy to my knees, but I could not bring myself to wash my boots. When dawn came, the air was thick with fog. Deputies marked off a wide area near the ditch and brought in shovels. A local news van arrived, its camera catching every movement. I stood behind the barrier tape with a few others, unable to leave. After about 20 minutes, one of the deputies called for the sheriff. They had uncovered something wrapped in a tarp, small, dark, and unmistakably human-shaped. The sheriff told the reporters to turn off their cameras, but everyone already knew. A woman behind me began sobbing, and someone else yelled that Paul should be dragged out of his house that instant. Paul was taken into custody that afternoon, though no one saw the evidence they had against him. His wife packed their belongings that same evening and drove away without saying goodbye to anyone. For a few weeks, the town lived in a fog of suspicion. Neighbors stopped talking to each other. Parents refused to let their kids walk alone, and even the church potluck was canceled. The sheriff said the investigation was still ongoing, but no charges were ever filed. People whispered that something about the evidence did not add up, that the tire marks might have been a coincidence. Still, no one dared to question the official story too loudly. Months passed, and the cornfields grew bare again. The festival was canceled the following year, replaced by a simple memorial service near the ditch. I stood there, watching the wind move through the dry stalks, and realized how quiet everything had become. It was not just grief. It was fear. Fear that someone still among us had done it. Fear that we might never really know. Sometimes when I drive past that field at night, I see flashlights flickering between the rows, like the search never ended. I know they are not real, but I still slow down and watch them until they fade. I have not been back since. The field was sold to a developer last spring, and they say new houses will be built where the maze once stood. People like to believe that time heals, but in our town it only buried what we could not face. Every autumn, when the air smells like wet hay and smoke, I think of Tyler, his blue hoodie, the pendant in the ditch, the silence that followed. None of us talk about it anymore, but every one of us remembers the night the search began, and the morning we wished we had never found what we were looking for. It happened during my senior year, after one of our late fall soccer practices. The days were already short, and by the time the bus left the school parking lot, the sky had that bruised purple color that means the sun is almost gone. There were 12 of us, plus our driver, Mr. Daly, a quiet man who always had an old thermos of coffee that smelled like burnt toast. Everyone was tired, still in our uniforms, our shoes muddy, music playing low from someone's speaker near the back. It felt like any other ride home, except for the route, a detour through a narrow road that cut between cornfields because of roadwork near town. About 20 minutes in, the engine made this coughing sound and the whole bus shuddered like it had hiccups. Mr. Daly tried to restart it, but after a few attempts, it just went silent. The air inside turned heavy, no hum of the motor, only the whisper of wind against the windows and the tall corn brushing along the sides. He told us to stay put while he went to look for help, said there was a farmhouse not far down the road. He grabbed his jacket, stepped out, and the door's pneumatic hiss was the last clear sound before everything felt strangely hollow. We waited, maybe 10 minutes at first, then 20. The light outside kept fading until all we could see through the glass was the dull reflection of ourselves and a thin stripe of orange horizon. Someone cracked a joke about ghosts in the corn to break the tension, but it didn't land. One of the younger students, Ellie, started recording on her phone, trying to capture how creepy the field looked. Just rows of stalks waving in the wind. The video's still online, I think, but the last part is what got people talking. Because after the laughter faded, there were footsteps, not Mr. Daly's, slower, uneven, circling the bus. At first we thought maybe it was him, or someone from the farmhouse he mentioned, but when Ellie called out, there was no reply. Just that rhythm of steps shifting through the dirt, stopping, then starting again from a different side. The kind of sound that doesn't match any pattern you recognize. Someone tried to use their phone flashlight to look outside, but the glare bounced off the glass, and it only made things worse, like we were trapped in our own reflection. That was when we heard the first tap on the side panel, light but deliberate near the emergency exit window. The tapping came again, this time closer to where we sat. It was faint, like the tip of a coin against metal, but steady enough that no one spoke over it. Someone whispered that maybe the wind was moving the stalks, but there was no wind strong enough to make that sound. Then came a scrape, long, dragging, along the length of the bus. It traveled slowly, almost as if whoever or whatever was outside was testing each panel. A few of us stood up and tried to look through the windows on that side, but it was useless. The corn was too dense, and everything beyond the glass looked like shifting shadows. Ellie stopped recording when the sound reached the back door. Her phone light flickered once, and I remember her face going pale in that dim glow. Mr. Daly had been gone nearly 40 minutes by then. We tried to convince ourselves that he was just lost, that maybe he had gone the wrong way down the road. One of the older boys, Ethan, said we should go find him, but nobody wanted to step outside first. It was strange. None of us said we were scared, but nobody moved either. The silence between us said everything. At some point, a pair of headlights appeared far down the road, faint but real. Everyone rushed to the front thinking help had come, but the lights never got closer. They just hovered there, distant and still, like whoever was driving had stopped in the middle of the road. When they finally blinked out, it felt like the night got heavier. The air turned colder inside the bus, though none of the windows were open. I could smell something faint then, wet dirt and something like rust. That was when the footsteps returned, faster this time, circling again. But there were more of them, too many. It sounded like a crowd walking through the field just out of sight, moving in patterns that made no sense. The rhythm of it built until the sound was coming from both sides, and a low voice, maybe 2 or 3 of them, started whispering our names. Not all of us, just a few. Mine was one of them. No one said anything after that. We just sat there, waiting until someone at the back said they saw a light inside the corn rows. The light was small, maybe the size of a lantern, weaving between the stalks as if someone was carrying it low. We all crowded toward the windows, but the glass fogged with our breath. I remember wiping it clear with my sleeve and seeing the light stop halfway to the bus. Then another one appeared behind it, and another, 3 in total, flickering like weak flashlights. For a moment, we were sure it was Mr. Daly bringing help, and the relief hit all at once, until one of the lights started moving upward, high above the corn, like it was floating. The other two stayed still. The laughter we expected never came. No voices. Just that steady shuffle of footsteps drawing closer again. Someone yelled that we needed to get out. Panic spread quick. Ethan pulled the emergency lever, and cold air rushed in with the smell of soil and something metallic. We climbed down one by one, our sneakers sinking into the soft dirt. The field surrounded us on every side, the corn towering higher than our heads. The bus lights flickered once behind us, then went dark. Nobody said a word after that. It was as if sound itself didn't want to exist out there. The only thing we could hear was breathing, ours, and something else pacing in rhythm just beyond the rows. When the police found me, it was already morning. I was sitting in the middle of the road, wrapped in one of those silver rescue blankets, staring at the spot where the bus had been. They said they found it a mile away, engine still cold, door open, no one inside. Every other student was gone. The only thing left was Ellie's phone wedged under one of the seats. They played part of the last recording for me later. Those footsteps, the low whisper, and then what sounded like wind passing through the microphone before it cuts off completely. I wish I could tell you more, but I do not remember anything after running into the corn. To this day, no one has found the others, not even a piece of clothing or a footprint beyond the road. The official report says the bus rolled down a slope and got stuck, that the kids must have wandered off in confusion. But I still hear it sometimes when I drive past empty fields at dusk, the same rhythm of steps brushing through dry stalks, circling, waiting. The sound follows the car for a while, then fades when the light is gone. That night feels like it never ended, like part of me is still sitting on that bus, watching those three lights sway in the dark.